Let's talk about culture. The first thing we need to do is to be clear about what we mean by the word. And since we want to use the term with an eye on the teaching and testing of intercultural competence, one aspect of culture may be particularly interesting. That is, the relationship between culture as we define it and the concept of personal identity as it connects with culture. In other words, to what extent do I, as an individual, represent my culture, or to what extent may my culture not provide a satisfactory explanation of who I am, both in self-perception and in the perception of others? Let's start by looking at how others have tried to define culture. Back in 1952, two American anthropologists published a list of definitions for culture which they had found used in various academic and non-academic contexts. They listed no less than 164 different uses. It may be realistic to assume that if a similar list was compiled today, the number would be considerably higher, what with new technologies and materials, what with globalization and a number of new contexts characteristic of the beginning of the 21st century. But how is this possible? Why is it that apparently anybody may use the term arbitrarily? Why can't people agree on one definition, for example, one like this? Culture is the collective programming of the mind. Or what about this one? Culture is the way in which a group of people solves problems and reconciles dilemmas. Perhaps it is because of the fluid and often ambiguous character of culture that scholars, pedagogues and trainers often resort to metaphors when it comes to describing what they mean. Here are some of the frequently used metaphors for culture, or rather certain aspects of culture. Can you identify the metaphors given on this slide and explain in what way they refer to culture? Intercultural theory 3.0, as some have called it, marks an interesting shift in the theoretical approach and empirical analysis of culture, which, from the perspective of pedagogues and testers, is particularly helpful. For today, a great number of sociolinguistic and discourse studies are available, which provide a theoretical framework which, quote, focuses less on broad constructs like culture and more on the everyday concrete actions through which culture is produced, unquote. The everyday concrete actions in question relate to a concept of culture in which practical communication and interaction play the central role. Studies of this kind provide empirical evidence of how cultural identities have been constructed in a variety of intercultural contexts through communication and interaction. It is precisely this approach which we suggest as a basis for the training of practical intercultural competence. To demonstrate how we understand culture, we would like you to meet Mr. Kim. Can you guess where he's from? You probably guessed right. Mr. Kim is Korean and lives in Seoul. He's married with 2 children. As is true for many Koreans, some of his views about life are based on what is called Confucianism. That is a worldview, non-religious by the way, which can be found in large parts of Asia. In a general way, most of Mr. Kim's ideas about right or wrong, how people should live and behave, the role family plays, how to behave in the presence of older people, etc., are based on Confucian values, rules, and traditions. His parents are of the generation who lived during World War II, who experienced the Japanese occupation and through much of their lives knew extreme poverty and hardship. Mr. Kim's children, on the other hand, grow up in a country of high living standards and enjoy a level of social security that was unknown in South Korea until recently. In many ways, Mr. Kim can be considered a typical Korean male, as he enjoys spending some of his free time together with other men, which sometimes includes going to football matches, drinking, going to karaoke parties and similar male activities. Professionally, Mr. Kim is a mechanical engineer working for a prestigious company based in Seoul. He is also a member of a professional association which provides up-to-date information, training courses, contacts among colleagues, and many other things relating to his professional interests. Clearly a highlight in his professional career was a 2-year assignment to Frankfurt, Germany, where he worked with a multinational and multicultural team, something which shaped his views about the world quite considerably. Let us pause here for a moment, because so far this is only one way of looking at Mr. Kim's personality. There are other ways of describing Mr. Kim, as you will see in a moment, which may prove just as interesting for our purpose. As a Korean, Mr. Kim clearly is a member of the Korean language community. He is also a member of the Confucian community of values, which in fact is true for many Asians. The way he speaks Korean is as 40-year-olds do. That is clearly not in the same way as, for example, his young children or 19 or 20-year-olds would. And naturally, the way he uses language is how men of his standing do, although perhaps he may be completely unaware of this at times. He has many years of experience in communicating effectively with clients, customers, partners, his boss, or with colleagues from other companies. And not to be forgotten, when in Frankfurt he learned something very special, insofar as he managed to use English efficiently, a foreign language to him after all, efficiently enough to get things done. By this we mean he could not always use English as a way of developing trustful personal relationships in every respect. For this he felt not always competent enough. However, using English as a kind of tool to arrange and coordinate things with his teammates worked quite well. Let's stop here again, since you may have understood the purpose of the second round. This way of looking at Mr. Kim's personality indicates the different discourse communities to which he feels he belongs, and each of which constitutes a culture of its own. In view of this, we may say that Mr. Kim belongs to various cultures, and this, we should be clear, is true for each and every human on earth. So reducing the relationship of an individual to, say, his or her national culture, that is, identifying a person as an American, a Chinese, a Frenchwoman, someone from a collectivist culture, etc., may not be enough. And if you look at things more closely, they are even more complicated than this. Let's take, for example, the Korean language community. This is by no means homogeneous, and this is true of every language worldwide. You will always find a great number of variations of how a language is used. These variations may be regional, social, professional, or similar. And coming back to Mr. Kim, we actually know nothing so far about the specific language variation Mr. Kim speaks, and which may be characteristic for him in a way. Equally, the Confucian community of values is extremely diverse as well. So we have no knowledge of which Confucian values Mr. Kim in particular finds binding for himself and feels he needs to comply with. Similar things may be said about each of the discourse communities indicated here. To conclude, there are two important things we would like to make clear using Mr. Kim as an example. Firstly, what we sometimes call culture can in fact always be seen as a community of discourse. Discourse about identities, values, behavior, roles, relationships, and more. There is no other way. We create reality as we see it always and only through communication and interaction. And language and how we are using it, that is one way of defining discourse, is always the key. Undoubtedly, language-based communication and interaction is what makes us humans. This is why it plays a key role in intercultural communication, and we need to pay attention to it. Secondly, Each individual relates to a number of macro, micro, regional, social, professional, and other cultures. In fact, no one can be seen as a monocultural island. It would not be helpful, therefore, if we try to associate a person with one, for example, national culture only, something which unfortunately has been common practice for many years. This is what the ICE course is about: preparing to see others not in stereotypical ways and to learn how to establish a relationship of trust with them using language. Now, what about you? How many cultures do you belong to? Try to fill in your personal profile concerning the discourse communities you associate with. Should this be of interest to you, you can download a free copy of the Mr. Kim worksheet plus trainer's notes from the ICE webpage as shown at the bottom of the slide. Thank you.